I would now like to introduce today's presenter. Amy Fong, partner, leads Everest Group's sourcing and vendor management practice. In this role, she advises enterprises on maximizing value for strategic provider relationships in global services categories. Banushi Malhotra is a practice director in Everest Group's sourcing and vendor management practice. In this role, she advises clients on maximizing value through their supply-based engagements to obtain cost, business, and operation benefits. And with that, I would like to turn things over to Amy.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining us today. We are happy to cover this topic of supplier relationship management and how you can really become a customer of choice. So we're going to start by just doing a quick intro to supplier relationship management, or SRM, and some of the evolution there, as well as challenges and best practices. And then we'll talk about critical SRM components, and we'll do that by giving several examples of what we've seen in companies that we think are doing a pretty good job of this in a very modern way. So let's next talk about the effective supplier management evolution and how we've seen really sourcing and procurement as a function, as well as SRM strategy, evolve over the last 5 to 10 years. Traditionally, we had a model that was based around savings, and most procurement organizations have tried to evolve their value into more sophisticated value creation based models, and objectives of supplier relationship management follow that. So we've moved from maximizing savings to maximizing value through cost and business impact, linking supplier performance with business goals, fostering innovation, driving continuous improvement, actively manage the risks related to suppliers, and creating a more competitive advantage with, with our supply base. And we've also seen a change in terms of the governance program really becoming more structured to drive more active stakeholder engagement as well. I want to take a pause here and do a poll. And I'd like to know, for all of you who are supplier management professionals on the line, what kinds of challenges do you face in your day-to-day operations? And we have several options here. Pick the one that's the most impactful to you. Inefficient supply management processes, inadequate resource utilization, regulatory compliance mismanagement, silos with data, that's a common one, misalignment with your business stakeholders, or lack of technology usage. And it may be all of these, but again, which one keeps you up at night the most? And there are likely more as well. Chiara, I'll let you close that poll when you see time. All right, and let's see what we have here. So inefficient supply management processes, misalignment looks like it's the top one. Sorry, they're not in order for me, but misalignment of business with procurement and business stakeholders was the most common one, but really it's all over the map. Looks like there are, almost even across all of the others. Regulatory, not as popular of an answer here, but that's probably only going to apply to some of you. Not all industries have regulatory requirements. So this is interesting to see, because it seems like there's a lot of pain points here. So if we jump into the next slide, we can talk a little bit more about some of the challenges that people are facing that we've seen. Let me make sure those results are shared there so you can all see it. And then we will move on to the next one and talk a bit about supply management challenges that we've seen in the clients that we've worked with. And probably very common things here, data silos, disparate systems, legacy systems, generally inefficiencies, as well as market events. Cybersecurity threats are big issues right now, and have been, but continue to get more visible, lack of maturity in the tools and the technologies in the market, as well as expensive resources. So there's really a lot of things in this space of supplier relationship management that I think are in general keeping sourcing teams up at night, keeping supplier relationship teams up at night. So we've laid out some of the challenges and where the evolution has happened. I want to deep dive now into the critical SRM components. And Banushi, do you want to take over and go through the next section?
So, if we look at best practice supplier relationship management, we really divide it into multiple attributes that would actually lead to an effective supplier management program, right? And we got a question actually in the list of questions that how are firms dedicating resources or time into this activity? And it's really a lot about how much you actually move towards that value creation business model, and you actually attribute resources to each of these activities. So in some firms, we've seen that the specific resources are allocated for, say, something like risk management or something like an innovation, while in some firms, you'll see that there is only performance management that is being managed, and that too on the contractual SLA level, and not much of resource investment has also gone into it. So it really depends from firm to firm and as well as industry as to how practices are well made. But what we're going to define here is best practice supplier management and all the things that go into it, starting from stratification, segmenting the supply base, governance, which talks about allocating the correct roles and responsibilities so that you don't have that misalignment with procurement and business stakeholders that you faced as such a big challenge. Then you have tools and technology in the marketplace, performance management, not just across contractual SLAs, but across all of the factors, including, say, innovation or your customer satisfaction of your stakeholders. And followed with more mature practices around risk management, including mitigation of risks, contingency planning, and ending with supplier-driven innovation, which is really done with your top tier of strategic suppliers. So with that, I would jump into each attribute one by one, and we want to do this in a little different way. We want to first describe the attribute to you. So we'll describe a little bit about how we've seen it happen in the market, and then we'll give you a specific case study through which we want to drive some key takeaways as to how this firm implemented best practices and gained the best output within this area. So starting with stratification, right? What is stratification? It's basically trying to segment your suppliers in different tiers, right? Which you can see in the pyramid here on the lower right part of the slide. So we have strategic suppliers, tier 2, as well as routine. This is not a standard, right? It can be very different. You want to do gold, platinum, silver. I've seen many different variations of this in the market. But basically, all the criteria that helps you define who are your top tier suppliers, and they need this dedicated SRM focus. That's the whole game of supplier stratification. So many firms use multiple factors that you can see on the top part of the slide, right? Spend is, of course, one of them, but there are many other different things that come into it to decide who is your top tier. So it can be relationship and tenure. It can be something like a compliance for especially, the BFSI industry. It can be risk impact, contract complexity, or the product or service that these suppliers are providing. So if we jump to the next slide, I want to show you a very specific example of an insurance firm who defined this multi-level supplier stratification process to specifically segment 500 of their suppliers into this strategic tier 2 as well as routine pyramid. And because of that, they were able to give very specific focus and allocate very specific resources to manage their strategic suppliers. And they were able to create sort of like a self-service mechanism for their tier 2 and routine suppliers. So say, the strategic suppliers were getting innovation-related support. They were given the support to be able to drive value, whereas the routine suppliers were only driven or measured in terms of contractual SLAs. So this particular firm actually used, as you can see on the slide, multiple parameters to classify their suppliers, critical processes, stakeholder interaction, spend, branding impact, etc. And they were able to drive a lot of benefits from these suppliers because of that. One thing that they also did very well was do a frequent review of these suppliers, right? So once you've classified a bunch of suppliers, you also need to revisit the stratification in some time, because it's not like these things stay fixed, right? Spend may change, your business impact may change. So we've typically seen that a best practice for firms to keep measuring their supplier stratification frameworks is within a span of, say, at least a year or so. Many firms do it biannually as well. So with that, I'll jump into the next criteria that we want to talk about, which is governance, right? So a well-defined governance approach, if you think about it, it's really about setting your goals of the supplier management program and then defining all the activities and processes that would help you meet that goal. So if you're setting your goal as, say, getting more technology into the SRM landscape or driving more innovation from your strategic suppliers, then how are you allocating resources to drive these particular activities? How are you ensuring that maybe, say, a procurement or a business stakeholder or a VMO is not doing the same activities again and again? You're not building redundancies within that. So there are very clear matrices that you can define through it. You can define a structure in it. You can define a RACI matrix, for instance, for each particular activity that needs to be driven within the supply management area. And then you can decide who is going to play the primary role within it, who's going to be the secondary role within it, as well as, who's going to sort of lead that from an executive lens. So all these things really are important factors in driving these activities, and having a very clear escalation matrix as well. For any sort of conflict resolution, who's going to be the stakeholder who will be involved, say, if a performance glitch happens, and who is going to communicate with the suppliers? What if the supplier is not resolving these glitches? Are you going to, escalate it and get the leadership involved as well? All these things come very clearly in the communication matrix. So if I give you an example of this firm, we recently worked with this. If we move to the next slide, you'll see we recently worked with this life sciences company. They basically wanted to define a vision for their vendor management office, right? So what we helped them with was try to make an activity map of all the activities that need to be done as part of a vendor management function. And then basically we defined who should be doing it. So if you see this table on the right-hand side, you'll see that we try to define a RACI for them, right? The VMO should be, say, consulted for vendor risk management, whereas procurement is responsible and accountable in this particular case. So I'm not saying that these are, prescriptive things that if VMO was consulted in this case, then it should be the case for all VMOs across the industry. It varies a lot, but there should be a clear mechanism in which you have defined that each activity is being done. So there's no activity that's just left out within the supplier relationship management process just because we as a firm have not been able to define it properly. So this was a part of the governance exercise. We want to jump into the next one, which is tools and technology.
All right, let me talk a little bit about technology. So if you look at the supplier lifecycle, and this is really excluding, sourcing, contracting, what I think of as the sort of sub-processes of source to pay. You have your, supplier, your category management, e-sourcing tools, contracting tools, contract lifecycle management. You have your P2P tools that do rec to PO, and then invoicing. But if we look at the supplier lifecycle, there's really a set of tools that stretch across all of those and cover everything from supplier information management to data enrichment and ratings and risk monitoring, invoice management, especially if you have very complex, and I don't mean just, receiving invoices and paying them, but kind of the obligation management against invoices as well, which can be very complex when we're talking about big services contracts, which is a lot of what we work with at Everest Group. Demand management, dashboards for stakeholders, and we haven't even gotten to SLA tracking and performance tracking yet, as well as any kind of collaboration tools. Before anybody says that their logo is missing on here, this is completely just a sampling. It is not meant to be exhaustive at all. This is not, a peak matrix or any kind of rating or ranking of these providers. But what we wanted to do was just give an idea of the variety of providers and what we actually see as the most common providers in a lot of these areas in the studies that we've done. It's not to say these are the only, and it's not to say these are the best, but as you can tell, there are a few that stretch across, but really there are a lot of different providers in this landscape that come into play when you're talking about supplier relationship management. And I think we often think, we can get one tool to do all of this, but there's, especially if you're in complex, outsourcing agreements where you have long relationships with a lot of obligations and a lot of risk factors, we don't necessarily, we don't necessarily, have one tool that can do all of this. So it's really imperative to clients to pick out the providers that are, the tools that are going to be best. And usually we see kind of a best of breed type approach on top of your core platform. So let's look at the next slide, which is actually an example. This is an insurance company we worked with. Insurance is one of those industries I mentioned up front that's very regulated. You have a lot of complex services agreement. Most of the spend is in services. And this particular provider had a fairly complex set of tools. So if you look at supplier onboarding and information management, supplier financials and risk management, and then supplier performance and relationship management across those three segments, they had quite a few different providers on the second tier here. And some of the greens were providers that they were adding in. So they were already using Ariba and Beeline. They were going to add in some ServiceNow for supplier information. That could also help across several other steps here, as well as RSA and Archer and Open Pages. And then you see there's still some areas that were fairly manual using Excel, PowerPoint, spreadsheets, databases like QuickView. That's very, very common in this area, that despite even having a number of different tools, there are still some processes that are fairly manual. So they tried to automate the tactical processes as much as possible, and then they tried to use best of breed solutions for performance management, and then have integration across other systems to create one unified supplier view in their data. The real key here is that it often is going to take multiple tools in the supplier lifecycle to address all of the activities, and integrating multiple views, making sure you have the right data, using emerging tools when you can, or best of breed tools when you can, to supplement is really, really important. There's a lot of gaps in the technology, and you don't want to be doing something on paper or spreadsheets if you don't have to. So the more automated and the more you can look at new technologies to help with this, the better off you'll be. So let's jump into another poll before we get too far into this. We're going to talk about performance metrics in a second and scorecards. And I would like to know which of the following metrics are part of your supplier scorecard. So there are a number here. You can, we have this as single choice. So pick the one that you weight the highest, I guess. This would normally be a multi-choice one, but because I'm sure a lot of you use a bunch of these, but what do you weight the highest in your supplier performance scorecard? Contractual performance, SLA, outcomes, ESG, environmental social governance factors, customer satisfaction, supplier financial risks, supplier attrition, reputational news on the supplier, cybersecurity elements, or innovation and process improvement. I'm definitely interested to see here what is the most common. And it looks like we could start wrapping it up. We're getting pretty strong answers here. Okay, so you should be able to see the results now, and definitely contractual performance, as well as SLA outcomes, and then customer satisfaction. And since we're looking at this in kind of the most common, or the most heavily weighted, sorry, I think seeing customer satisfaction is actually pretty interesting there. We are starting to see more companies use things like experience level agreements or customer sat related scores to measure their suppliers. And I think that's a really interesting turn that definitely brings out some of the best, the most important things. So let's look at the next slide. And I think one thing to think about when we talk about performance metrics is that it can get really overwhelming. We often see, too many metrics. and actually wrote a paper a long time ago, Too Many Metrics Spoil the Scorecard. But, you definitely want to measure a lot of things. And what we recommend is kind of aggregating different categories of metrics. So the ones that we see most commonly is, things around contractual performance, customer satisfaction, which could be a combination of different metrics that are related to whatever service or good are being delivered. Risk is pretty complex, but again, a number of different things that could be a part of that. ESG could include the diversity inclusion that your supplier has, as well as sustainability factors, as well as fair labor practices, and innovation and process improvement. These are all kind of buckets that you could have. The metrics underneath them could vary based on the category or the supplier that you're covering and the kind of work they're doing for you. But then at the top level, if you have common aggregation categories, you can kind of compare suppliers across those categories when you do look across those different groups of metrics when you look across categories.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah. So one of the things that is worth noting over here is that not all of these categories are equally important, of course, right? Which you could have seen from the results on the previous page. So
Yes.
Different priority levels, probably, you would assign a lower priority level to something like an ESG. But when you also look at measuring these particular criteria, then again, contractual performance will be measured very regularly, whereas something like an ESG, it will be self-reported by suppliers, and it won't be measured so frequently, along with something like an innovation, right? You would think that you can assign a KPI to innovation, but it's not always possible because it's a very qualitative type of area that you can't really assign a numerical value to. So that is also something that is measured at after very long intervals of times in some organizations when they actually start seeing the results being driven by innovation.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great point. Under each of those metrics is a frequency and a methodology and a weighting. And that's really important to think through what matters most to your business, your stakeholders, and whether you have a balanced view. And another thing to think about, and this slide is setting alert triggers. So it's really important to have some kind of trigger for when there needs to be a performance remediation process or plan put into place. So you're going to have, a lot of different levels of activities, KPI reports, which are really just the metrics that you use to assess service delivery across their commitments, across the provider's commitments. KPIs generally tied to SLAs that are in your agreements, critical alerts when something is off or out of spec, out of the threshold of what's allowed. And then you need to put in a remediation plan. That's typically something that stakeholders will need to work with the supplier on. And then, of course, an issues log that helps to track some of the issues that have happened. There's some examples of alert triggers on here for common metrics. So for instance, if you're looking at operational and SLA compliance, if you're less than 80% for 3 consecutive months, that would be a pretty significant trigger. You may have an escalation path as well that you would use in that case. Attrition is the one that's probably near and dear to people right now because there is a talent shortage and a war for talent going on, and we see very high attrition levels at a lot of the service providers that are really much higher than what we had seen in the past, and are probably breaking that threshold on a pretty regular basis based on some of the calls that we get. So really thinking through this is important. The next slide, we have another example here of a financial services firm that had a balanced scorecard for their outsourcing vendors. They were really focused on having CXO involvement in their remediation plans. So there's a bit of a sample scorecard here. It's it might be a little small on the slide, so I won't try to read through it all, but the key here is that they were summarizing, where there were misses that month. They had corrective plans in place that they described, and then a list of things that were being measured and the goals and the actual data, as well as any commentary on the trend. And so this was used as kind of a way to communicate and agree between the supplier and the buyer. Some of the key principles here are that there was really ongoing collaboration and handholding for any kind of corrective action plans. They did use market intelligence to improve performance and risk scorecarding, and did regular reassessment of the scorecarding metrics to make sure that they were in line with the market. And they all also focused on innovation and productivity tracking to try to get gains there. So really critical here to be able to balance these multiple parameters and ensure that anything off is related to appropriate remediation plans. If you're too focused on one metric, it's very easy to forego other metrics and focus in the wrong place. Banushi, could you talk a little bit more about risk now?
Sure. So with risk management, we see that there are, of course, two areas that you need to think about, right? One is the whole measurement aspect. What are the metrics you should be measuring and how often you should be tracking them, etc., which is what we're trying to cover in this particular slide. And the next part we'll talk about in this is a little bit about mitigation planning. Like once you've faced a risk, or just if you're thinking about that, then what are the plans that you should have in place before actually facing the risk? So with the first aspect, which is the type of risk metrics, we have a lot of factors that we've tried to put in on this page, starting from financial health, supplier organizational changes, business impact, geographic related aspects, as well as supplier environment, right? What are the fourth party risks that the supplier may be facing, confidentiality related aspects. And then again, as we said in the performance scorecard, even within the risk scorecard, there will be different frequencies of measurement. So something like a financial health, if you can, relate to the color coding here, it's going to be measured at the time of onboarding of the supplier, as well as on a quarterly and monthly basis, or monthly basis in some firms. Maybe, directly in your QBRs, you're asking for the supplier to send self-reports, or you have a tie-up with someone like a D&D who's actually sending you these Z-scores of the supplier. Similarly, if you look at something like, maybe geographic related aspects, then you can see that it's tracked at the time of onboarding, on a trigger-induced basis, as well as semi-annually, if you take it normally. And the reason for that is that, when you look at political or economic issues, you need to be very sure that you have some sort of alerts that are coming up in case there is an issue that comes up, right? Take an example of the Ukraine-Russia war. You could not have been tracking that on a semi-annual basis because you would not have reacted at the right time in that case. So some aspects are really important to be measured more on a trigger-induced basis, and many SRM teams have a tie-up with, say, technology or tool providers that Amy had mentioned, or even within their whole S2P suite. For example, say an Ariba, they would be sending them reputational risk alerts or geographic risk alerts related to these issues, which the SRM team is tracking on a regular basis. So if we move to the next slide, we get to the whole risk mitigation aspect of it, right? What we saw was that, a VMO or a vendor management office, they look at the entire supplier portfolio, and then they design their supplier portfolio strategies, and there are different risk levels assigned to each strategy. So say, for instance, you're looking at something like a portfolio consolidation. That means that you're reducing the number of suppliers that are there. What you're doing now is putting a high risk on because you're increasing dependency on a particular set of vendors. So in that case, the risk that you need to mitigate is that you need to think about, do we have, say, a backup supplier identified in case there's a critical process that is being driven by only one supplier? It's very easy to, say, take your portfolio from 100 supplier application outsourcing to just 3 suppliers in it. But are you actually able to drive those risk mitigation plans with those set of suppliers itself? Especially looking at the scenario in the world market that has been there in the past couple of years. Similarly, when you look at something like, addition of new suppliers, which is on the right most side of this slide, portfolio diversification. These days, what's happening is that a lot of new specialist players are getting added to the mix, because we're looking for newer skills, we're looking for niche skills that many of these specialist providers are able to provide. But in that case, are you able to look at all the parameters, which I mentioned on the previous page, financial, operational, etc., for these specialist or niche players as well? Because they're not those large Accenture TCS type of players anymore. They're really small, and you need to do a very high level of tracking for them as compared to what you were probably doing for these large outsourcing players. So some best practices in this contingency planning. The first one is to do contingency planning, right? We did a survey, I think, recently, and we found that many firms, I think greater than 70% firms were just not doing any sort of backup supplier identification, also even for their critical processes. So that is one very big red flag. And that really came out when the crisis struck them, right? During the time of COVID or during the time of this whole Ukraine-Russia war situation, or now with the inflation, service provider rate increases. So identifying backup suppliers as a best practice at the time of setting contracts in the initial stage itself, if you have backup suppliers identified, that's a very big risk mitigation activity. Followed by that, of course, if the new supplier that needs to be selected as a backup, you need to have that certain level of information about them from the beginning itself. Not saying that you do tracking on them also on a regular basis, but there should be some sort of supplier onboarding that should be conducted on them in the beginning. So these are a couple of things for risk mitigation. And one, case example, if we move to the next slide, that we wanted to share was of this transportation and logistics company. Now, this was the IT VMO lead, and they planned out a very planned supplier portfolio strategy, which was very well designed according to the risk mitigation planning that the firm had decided upon. So they'd selected their supplier mix was a base of 10 to 15 suppliers who were acting as, again, those value-driven partners or strategic partners for the IT function. And they defined a risk management framework in which each location was being serviced by at least 2 suppliers at a time. So for instance, if an Accenture is able to cover that and it's the primary service delivery partner in a particular location, then you would also have, say, a Wipro as a backup supplier in that case, who's delivering a small part of those operations, so that in case Wipro needs to scale up when Accenture fails, they're able to do that. In itself, so that in case risk arises, you're already on the right path. Great. And another thing they've done, I think one point, just can we move to the previous slide? Yeah. Another thing that done was, again, build the sort of multiple time zone presence because of this all-time service delivery. So you have multiple players, you have different players that are identified in regional areas as well. So you never are able to not service a location in case a critical business requirement comes about. So this was all about risk management and mitigation planning. If we move to the next and the last and the most mature capability within supplier relationship management, it's innovation. And we have seen many different versions of innovation being practiced across our clients and across a lot of enterprises in general. And we've seen that the key area that firms can emphasize on in the first place is trying to understand whom to do this innovation practice for. So we spoke a lot about, supplier stratification, how to classify top tier suppliers, etc. But are we actually able to, build those innovative practices with the top tier strategic providers or not? And are these strategic providers your value add partners as well? Are they doing activities such as, maybe giving you value add commitments? You're able to return transformational savings to them. They're able to drive productivity, and they're able to get in some level of automation within your service delivery, improving on a day-to-day basis. So we've seen many examples of innovation in that sense. And one thing that firms really do a mistake in is thinking that day-to-day business as usual activities are actually also classified as innovation, because that's how the supplier would come and market themselves to you, right? So you need to understand that there's a difference between business as usual and micro innovation, as well as macro innovation planning. And macro innovation planning is something that is a very, very long-term activity. It would impact your TCO, would get you a lot of value, but it would also take a lot of time. And it's not something that you can measure quantitatively. It cannot be added to your performance scorecard as a KPI. You have to be very qualitative in that. And there should be a leadership to leadership connect in case that is happening. So one example that we wanted to talk to you about in terms of innovation was this insurance firm. Now, this was a very interesting one, right? Because we saw that this firm had placed an entire steering committee which sort of sat on top of their lines of business, the supplier relationship owners, as well as the supplier risk management team and procurement team. and they governed innovation with their large outsourcing partners. So this steering committee, that job was to ensure that there was a level of innovation being driven from these providers, and all the departments under them, they reported to this committee to ensure that happened on a regular basis. So there was this component of innovation that flew into the performance scorecard, and this committee made sure that they designed the program for innovation so that this is carried on, and sort of not like an idea that some supplier gave in a QBR and then nobody followed up with it. This was the committee that took care of that entire aspect. So there were regular, if you see some best practices that we noted on this slide, there were very regular innovation days and jams with suppliers to communicate the intended outcomes of the company. So if a company wants to drive some particular objective, they would just come out with that objective in that particular innovation day. And then they would expect the supplier to come up with ideas and sort of have that entire idea sharing construct, right? You're treating them as partners and not like trying to give some task to them that they would just complete like that. So these are, and this committee was sort of driving that because the relationship owners were monitoring the performance on a day-to-day basis as well. So it was a very collaborative approach, and that entire culture of innovation was actually what was able to drive innovation very well in this particular company. So having dedicated resources, again, is not everybody, not everyone can allocate the budget to it and have that value, but it's just about building that culture so that the supplier is able to come up to you with ideas and you're able to implement them at the right time. Yeah. So with that, I think we'll jump into our, call to action for this.
Yeah. So we're going to make an offer here. Essentially, we want to make sure that everyone on the buy side who's on this call, anybody who's managing suppliers or sourcing from the categories that we cover, has access to market intelligence. That's something that we really pride ourselves on at Everest Group. So there is a link in the chat here. You have 3 options to choose from. If you go to that link, you can choose a report that gives you insights on service providers. There's several service provider snapshots to choose from, insights on locations, and there are several of our location spotlights, as well as some state of the market and thematic reports. There's also a report that goes through some of the best practices in category management. So we encourage you to click that link in the chat right now. We will contact you with a copy of the report, as well as time to speak with one of our analysts if you'd like. We have about 400 analysts covering different areas of global services who can help you with any questions you had. So for those who've made it through 39 minutes of the webinar, this is kind of your give back to wrap this up. And we'll leave that link there. You can certainly click it anytime before the event ends. But let's start to wrap up with some key takeaways. So a few things that I want to make sure that we highlighted. First of all, Banushi talked about stratification, multi-level stratification, using a variety of factors that are valued to the business. And this really helps you focus your efforts. The whole idea of stratification is that you can't spend all the time you would want and all the resources you would want with everybody, with every single supplier. So thinking through how you spend your time, where you're going to, it's not just here's the tiers, but here's the governance strategy for each of these tiers. Here's the performance management strategy for each of these tiers. So that segmentation kind of stretches across a lot of the other areas that we've talked about today. Tools that we talked about, having the right tools is really important. And these range from ERPs and source to pay platforms to business intelligence tools to very, very specialized best of breed applications that might fit the needs of specific industries better than others. So, excuse me. So making sure you have that correct tool set or the best possible tool set is really important.
Yeah. One of the things I think is what so one of the things, is worth noting in this whole tools and technology landscape is that the market is not really perfect in this, right? So there's not one single suite that you can buy and that will serve all your supply management needs. It's very fragmented in terms of the marketplace as well. And it's not very mature and evolved as well when you compare it to a sourcing tool landscape. So
Yeah.
that is one sort of, kind of like an evolution that we would probably see in the next couple of years as well.
Yeah, I think we'll see. In fact, I'm at Digital Procurement World this week, and there's quite a few interesting tools I'm expecting to see here. Just that, the technology has evolved so much even in the last 6 months that we can do so much more than we could a few years ago. If you haven't been in the market for new tools, now is the time, really. The other piece is, thinking about high priority risk and performance assessment areas, tracking those at onboarding and periodically, as well as when there's an event triggered that indicates something might have changed. I would say it's also important to establish those upfront and even include, in many cases, they should be included in the RFP. So best practice really is to include your SLAs and your KPIs and your performance measurements in the RFP so that providers know what to expect and they scope the work appropriately so that they can meet your standards and then stick to that all the way through. You can't just, get halfway through a contract and then put up new requirements. That's very difficult to manage too, and you won't likely be successful. Risk and performance management is really an area that people are doubling down on, given the complexity of portfolios right now. And I think innovation driving activities and culture are also really key to driving superior outcomes. In fact, some of the difference that we saw in companies that we've spoken to, especially around the amount of innovation they get from their providers, really comes down to, are you listening to the providers? Do you have a culture where they can share and bring ideas? Is management involved? Is it executive to executive? And those are some very soft seeming activities, but they really do drive true value and benefits in the longer run.
Yeah. I think one of the questions that we'd gotten from the people who are attending is that what are the most effective ways of encouraging suppliers to identify and implement ideas and also drive growth. So one of the answers to that would be having a joint roadmap with the supplier, right? Like you want to have an innovation roadmap, but you're just encouraging suppliers to give ideas, and you're not building sort of like a playbook to make sure that they're able to implement the ideas and they get the right resources to them to be able to do so. Many a times in a lot of regulated firms, we've noticed that the supplier is not able to navigate through the internal bureaucracies to be able to kind of get his idea into place. He's just stuck into some sort of paperwork or not getting to the right stakeholder. So you need to have this sort of right committee in place to help the supplier drive these innovative practices, because they're also trying to drive your growth. It's not just that they're just there for service delivery. They're also your valuable partners in that sense. Yeah.
Definitely. So with that, we can, Vidushi, were there any questions in the Q&A that you wanted to address? I know you hit on a couple of them as we were going. I'll let you read off any that we could answer. For anyone on the line, if you want to ask a question, you can use the Zoom question feature, Q&A feature. Usually it's at the bottom of the window.
Yeah.
And just another reminder on that research offer.
I think one of the questions that we have probably addressed is what methods should be used to measure the maturity of the relationship. So I think there are, two ways that you can do that. One is the supplier stratification framework that we already mentioned, that you classify suppliers through multiple parameters. And also you just say the type of activities that they're driving for you, right? So if we sort of saw the innovation slide that we just got into, if they're helping you with your M&A transition as well, then obviously they're a value add player. But if they're just, you're just doing performance monitoring to measure their progress, and they're just giving you staff or resources, then they're not really a very, value add partner. They're more of a labor arbitrage type of supplier for you. So these are just some nuances that you can build into a framework to measure the maturity of the relationship. And there are different priorities that each organization assigns to these type of metrics. So for instance, somebody like an insurance firm that we recently worked with, they gave compliance a very high weightage in their supplier stratification framework, which is quite obvious, right? And brand impact is also very important for the suppliers that are actually leading to your customers and kind of they're involved in that interface that directly reaches customers. So these are the things that would kind of help you define this maturity of the relationship.
I see a question here. Have you seen the VMO ever outsourced, or is it too critical to outsource? I think that's a really interesting question there. So I would have to look at the data on this. I don't have it accessible right now, but I would say less common to outsource vendor relationship management. In fact, the companies that have the biggest outsourcing portfolios, tech, are probably financial insurance, financial services, banking, insurance, capital markets, tend to have large vendor management organizations focused on tech and operations providers. And those are obviously in-house. Not to say that parts of it haven't been. There's certainly activities that could be given to a third party, but I do generally see it in-house and really focused on aligning the vendors with the stakeholders.
Especially something like an SLA tracking or a performance monitoring activity is something that is
outsourced. Definitely. Some of the data aspects for sure, yeah.
Okay, great. So the next question is, what is the evolution of SRM? Is it moving from performance management to risk management centered? And what is the next iteration to SRM after risk management, after performance and contract performance management? Okay, great. So I think, the way I've seen it, it's not really been that, performance to risk type of framework. It's more of a cost-driven to a value-driven type of framework that we described initially. And the value-driven aspects, of course, cover more around performance management. So if you were just doing SLA tracking initially, now you're looking at more ways that you can drive value through performance. And again, even within risk management, you're looking at more risk-related aspects, measuring risk in a better way than you were doing earlier. Not just trigger-induced like we were doing earlier, but in a more holistic way that you're measuring it on an ongoing basis. And you're also doing mitigation planning on an ongoing basis. And of course, the next iteration to SRM, I think, would be innovation. Is something that if you start doing innovation with your most mature providers, then that is where you're actually getting value add from it.
That's great. Good points. All right. Any other questions there that you wanted to cover, or should we wrap up?
Just going through the list.
Definitely. I see somebody who couldn't get the link for the research offer. We'll reach out to you. If you can't, for some reason, open that link. Not sure what's going on there, but comment in the chat, and we will have someone on the team reach out and make sure that you get that opportunity.
One interesting question is on, will SRM be absorbed by business teams, or should we make the case to host it in the procurement department?
Yeah, do you want to answer that, or I have some thoughts on that one too?
Yeah, no, you go ahead. I know you have some thoughts.
Yeah, so I mean, we've already seen that to some extent, right? IT has had vendor management organizations for a long time. I think the example I gave of tech and ops, that's VMOs, that's often separate from procurement. So I think of it almost a little bit separately, a VMO versus a broader supplier relationship management team. Often when procurement is doing SRM, we're looking at a very high level across different business units and stakeholders. And we may have suppliers that provide services to a lot of different business units and stakeholders across the company or the organization. And that's really where some of these more strategic SRM activities come in. Whereas I think a lot of the business unit plays a role, or the function, if it's IT or whatever, they play a role in the day-to-day operations and the management and the performance management. So I really don't think it's either or. I think it's both. What you want is both of those teams, but with defined roles, as Banushi mentioned earlier.
I think a similar question that we can link to that is, will procurement managers need to rely more on SRM principles? Or will it still remain a separate team within procurement organization. So, right, I think you covered that within this as well, right? That so we've also seen that some capabilities are covered within procurement within the SRM domain. So say a risk management, probably a sourcing or a procurement is leading it. But apart from that, there's a VMO that's leading all the other aspects of it. So there are different ways that firms are doing it.
Yeah. And we'll definitely share the slides for this deck, and the recording will also be available for those of you who are asking. So. I did see a question. Sorry, go ahead, Venushi. We both have a lot to say on this.
Did I say? I didn't say anything. Please continue.
Oh no, I thought you were. I was going to say a question about being a customer of choice. What are the benefits of being a customer of choice? And that's a great question. I see ways that you can become a customer of choice, or at least have a better supplier experience, both on the operational, the P2P side, paying your bills on time, making it easy to get paid, as well as in the more strategic SRM side of, bringing opportunities for suppliers to bring innovation. I think the biggest thing I've seen there, especially in services, is that if you are a customer that's offering more opportunity, is easier to work with, is, giving your suppliers an opportunity to highlight their innovation, you're going to get better service. Honestly, we all know that these suppliers, service providers, have multiple teams. They have an A team, they have a B team, they have a C team. We all do in our own companies too. Anybody performing a service tends to have that. You're going to get more resources, you're going to get more effort, more focus. And so, I've certainly worked with companies on the sell side that they decide where to assign, their efforts. And for customers that are harder to work with, that don't offer as much promise, there's a premium to that as well, and it's baked in. So all of that is fairly nuanced, and you could say, well, we go to RFP and we make it very competitive. But in the end, the way to really be competitive is to partner with your suppliers. And procurement's role is not just to get, negotiate for cost savings, it's to harness the value of the supply base. If you truly want to harness the value of the supply base, being a valued customer to your suppliers is really a big part of that. It's a two-way street. And so that's why, I've always thought this is a really important area. And, the value starts to come out long-term in a variety of different ways. All right. Anything else, or should we wrap up on that last soapbox stand there?
So I think there's one question that we can probably address, and I'll take a stab at it and you can add in. But it's around, is there any best practices around setting supplier incentives? I think Stephen is asking this question. So the question is actually around the practices of VMO, and when performance is not met, how are people managing to exceed performance standards, and how are they giving suppliers such incentives that they're able to meet such standards? So I think in terms of that, the contracting really comes into play, right? Like we've seen, for instance, things like value being given back to the supplier if they give value to the firm. So the savings that they generate within their construct, they're actually given a return on that. So those sort of funds are also built into the contract. And this is a very big incentive that is built into the contracting process. And that, of course, money motivates, right? So suppliers are also motivated by such things. So that is one big way that you can drive suppliers.
Yeah, I've definitely seen gain sharing type models and innovation programs where there is some kind of benefit to both parties. Maybe, the innovation, and this is another benefit of good supplier relationships, is just early access to technology. And there's certainly a ton of examples out there, especially in the tech sector, where accessing a technology earlier benefited the buyer, but then the supplier also had an opportunity there to pilot the technology. And then, after they made it, more market known and piloted it, beta tested everything with that one buyer, they can expand it and they reap the benefits of that. So that's another, it's another incentive there if it's set up correctly. That's a little bit different than a performance standard, but it's more of a benefit to both parties. Right, and I think we're getting close to time, so let's wrap up and end on time. Again, thank you everyone for attending. We will be sending out the recording as well as sending out the slides. The recording is always on our website. I would encourage anyone who's not been to the Everest Group site, in our reports, access reports area, there is a ton of complementary research there, including all of the webinars we've done, some ESG tools that we've put together, as well as other reports, blogs, things that you can access for no cost if you're not a member. If you're interested in that research offer, please click that link. That is open to services buyers. It's not open to sellers, service providers. Doesn't really make sense to have it for them. They get our research in a different way. If you are a member of our Outsourcing Excellence program, you don't need to click that. You already have access to thousands of reports, and those are included in the reports that you access as a client of Everest Group. So thank you again, everyone, for attending. Hopefully this was beneficial and you learned something. And I appreciate all the questions. That's been great. Good to see so much activity on this. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.